Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Martha. Last year, when my book had just come out, I had hoped to speak to Faculty Forum on this topic, but was then asked to share my work as a Center for Christian Studies Fellow. So when first Suzanne and then Martha approached me about speaking about it this semester, I feared perhaps the topic that it was too late. However, a dear friend and colleague has assured me that not many people at Gordon have read my book yet, that some people might feel guilty about that, and they would much rather come to a faculty forum and hear me talk about it than have to read it after all. So, consider yourself absolved, though I do see some students here who I know have been required to read it, so I'm grateful for their presence. Now, before you think you've gotten off lightly, let me tell you what you're going to be hearing about today. I'm going to tell you about two old men who are anchorites. This means that they withdraw from human contact, they live alone in monastic cells, they rule over a monastery full of people, but in a decidedly antisocial fashion. They won't meet with the monks who are in their charge, or the many guests who visit the monastery. They live a couple of miles from a major city, but they never visit it. They live for decades enclosed in individual cells. They don't leave. They won't see visitors. They won't talk to anybody. They won't look anyone in the face. They fast, eating only some bread and water from time to time. So, what could we possibly have to learn from people such as these? What relevance could their experience have for our own spiritual journeys and our Christian communities? The theme of learning from Christian communities far removed from our own is one that I return to again and again in my classes. Reaching across time to men and women who live in cultures profoundly alien to our own is actually a task of critical urgency. We have connections with Christians from other cultures and eras, unavoidable connections. We're part of a spiritual family. We have connections not based on blood or marriage ties, but on shared worship of Jesus as Savior. As much as the outward expression of Christian worship has changed, and the intellectual understanding of Christian doctrine has developed, the recognition of Christ as Redeemer creates spiritual kinship. Now, one benefit from studying Christians in profoundly different cultures is that it gives us a new vantage point on our own faith. We can see the interface between faith and culture with fresh eyes, not blinded to it by the very familiarity of our own environments. We can learn from the experience of others, both from their wisdom and also from their shortcomings. I think we need to balance an awareness of cultural context, what historical, social, political distinctives separate us from Christians in the past, with a willingness to be open to the instruction from our sisters and brothers in Christ who live in previous ages. Practicing the skill of stepping outside our own culture and identifying the things that operate within our culture help us to see what things are making demands on us. By studying the other cultures, we see our own better. There are always going to be barriers separating us from people in other periods and cultures. In the case of 6th century Christianity in Gaza, our topic for today, I think perhaps the practice of asceticism itself is the most off-putting. So that's what I first wanted to talk a little bit about. I was first attracted to this topic of early Christian asceticism as a graduate student, and I was attracted to it by the very strangeness that seems to cling to early protagonists of monastic literature, people like St. Anthony or St. Mary of Egypt. These early Christian exemplars, considered extreme even by Christians of their own day, were held up in the early church as models of repentance, chastity, humility, self-renunciation. Living alone in the desert, tried by physical hardship and demonic forces, early Christian anchorites seem far removed from the concerns and practices of modern Christians in the Protestant tradition. This is true not only for American Christians, but it's also true of others. I learned this when I shared Athanasius' life of St. Anthony with Ukrainian Pentecostal students who were quite quick to question the validity of this monk's vocation. I think it would be very easy for Christians today to dismiss the entire ascetic endeavor as a misguided capitulation to Neoplatonic dualism. Monastic literature sometimes does borrow dualistic rhetoric that seems dismissive of the body in the physical world. But ultimately, Christian asceticism rejected any dualistic beliefs that elevated the spirit over the material world. Monks repeatedly emphasized the physicality of the gospel. Not only did Christ become human with a body, but he endured great physical sufferings and the ultimate bodily humiliation, death. In imitating Christ's sufferings through martyrdom and then asceticism, the Christian's body became an instrument by which God could work out the mystery of salvation. Christ's bodily resurrection was the guarantee for Christians' own expectation of physical resurrection. So Christian ascetics, instead of using the body as for the purpose of procreation, which is an avenue to immortality in many ancient religions, Christian ascetics choose to use the body for worship. For the monk, the body becomes the canvas on which to practice a new form of spirituality, taming physical passions in order to pursue union with God. Now, the chief motivation for early Christian ascetics is a very literal interpretation of the gospel. Jesus had told the rich young ruler who had fulfilled all the law, if you would be perfect, go, sell what you have, give the money to the poor, and come follow me. Ascetic Christians take this command at face value. Jesus also taught, anyone who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And anyone who does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, cannot be my disciple. Ascetic Christians withdraw from the social obligations of the broader society and culture in order to forge a new community where spiritual kinship replaced biological ties. The experience of Christian ascetics offers much to benefit Christians of all denominations today. Their call to a life of prayer, their yearning to be committed to God without distractions, their recognition of the importance of the body as a locus for spiritual disciplines, and their attempts to create a shared life in common with other Christians. My study of early Christian asceticism has shaped my own spiritual development, as the wisdom of the desert anchorites has convicted me repeatedly of my own unworthy preoccupations. In my research on the 6th century anchorites, Barsanuphius and John of Gaza, I was absorbed in reconstructing the colorful social setting of city, village, monastery, responding to earlier treatments that had really privileged ascetic theology. I was interested more in the historical context. I wanted to know about the real life situations that provoked the questions that were brought to the anchorites. So this was my agenda, to look at the historical context and the social and cultural values at work. But even with this purpose, that earthy wisdom of the holy men sometimes jolted me out of this 6th century cultural context, and I realized that their assessment of the human predicament applied to my own experience as well. The words of holy men and holy women have the ability to transcend cultural boundaries and remind us of the frailty of humanity and the limitlessness of divine mercy in our own churches, families, and academic departments. As a Christian, I embrace the spiritual lessons of desert fathers and mothers, but at the same time, I reject many of their basic assumptions, embedded as they are in a cultural milieu that I do not share. For instance, the belief that virginity is inherently superior to marriage was commonplace among late antique Christian writers. In fact, it's almost a unanimous assumption. The scholar Jerome boasts when he's talking about children being dedicated to virginity. He says, "I praise wedlock, I praise marriage, but it is because they give me virgins." This view, personally, I consider mistaken. But I also consider flawed the alternate contemporary fallacy that's common in evangelical circles that privileges marriage as a Christian norm. Rejecting centuries of tradition that elevated celibacy for spiritual purposes, Protestant churches today relegate the unwed to the transitional status of singles, awaiting human soulmates in order to have complete fulfillment. While I have not been tempted to undertake the life of a monk, I have learned to appreciate the monastic vision of human beings' place in the cosmos and to wistfully yearn for the contemplation available in a desert cell. It is this kind of openness to the experience of Christians whose life situation at first appears completely foreign to us that I want to pass on to students. I think there's a danger that we might too quickly reject the teachings of early Christians on things like doctrine, things like a spiritual practice, because they're advocated by people who are committed to ascetic behavior and purposes. But I'm not blind to the different worlds inhabited by early Christian monks and modern scholars. In fact, a couple years ago, I found much amusement as I completed my seminar in the Desert Fathers to wonder what St. Anthony might have thought of an academic female, 9 months pregnant, teaching about the vocation of celibacy. There's another misconception about asceticism that is important to dispel. This is the notion that asceticism is a retreat from the real world. I think this is very similar to many of my students' misguided assumptions that life at Gordon College is life in the Gordon bubble. The reality of the human predicament is that when you take a whole bunch of people, whether Christian college students or monks, and you put them together in one community, they bring with them sin, selfishness, heartache, and suffering. This is the real world. When I was a student at Gordon, I had friends dealing with eating disorders, scars of childhood sexual abuse, alcoholism, parents' divorce. I actually had a roommate my junior year whose mother was homeless, living on the streets of New Jersey. I'm sure all of you could add your own stories. This is the real world. This is not a bubble. And likewise, the monastery outside of Gaza that I write about is the real world. There's one monk, Dorotheus, who comes off a little bit like an intellectual snob, and he relates to us how his fellow monks ostracized him. He complains once that fellow monks swept biting insects into his cell so that he was tormented by bites and itching and hurting all over. He also complains of another monk urinating on him as he slept. Okay, so the monastery is also the real world, not a Christian bubble. Not only was the monastery, like a Christian college, filled with all manner of heartache, sin, and dysfunctionality, but it was also the real world in a more positive sense. At a Christian college, we create space in which to train spiritual leaders and intellectual leaders. The monastery did the same. In fact, monks were the spiritual and intellectual leaders of society. Monasteries function not as places of retreat, but as agents of mission. Monks traveled to places where others feared to go. They set up intentional Christian communities from which the gospel was proclaimed to the surrounding pagan inhabitants. They offered food, clothing, physical healing, Christian love to those in need. They welcomed new converts to come worship with them. So the monastery has functioned as the chief agency of mission in the Christianization of many regions of the world, not only in late antiquity, but in other times and places. Now, from early Christian monasticism in general, I'd like to turn to a monastery one monastery in particular, and introduce you to a Christian community whom I have come to know well. Abba Sarados's monastery, and Abba, as you know, means father, flourished in the 6th century. It was located a couple of miles outside of Gaza in a village called Tawatha, a short walk from a very sophisticated urban commercial center, one of the major centers of the Eastern Mediterranean world. At the crossroads of key international trade routes, Gaza had bustling marketplaces displaying products from all over the world, crowded theaters, and extensive public baths. It had beautiful gilded churches with lovely mosaics. It had one of the most prestigious institutions of higher learning in the whole world. Its citizens boasted of the city's great importance and the congenial disposition of its sophisticated inhabitants. Life in the neighboring monastery was a bit plainer. Some monks lived together in the conobium, that central monastic group of buildings, under the abbot's authority, sharing work, meals, daily prayer. Like most monasteries, this monastery included a guest house to receive the many visitors who came, an infirmary to care for the sick, a dormitory, a church for communal worship. Outside these central buildings, scattered throughout the desert landscape, there were numerous cells of anchorites, where older, more experienced monks went to live alone or perhaps with a young disciple, pursuing the monastic vocation of prayer. These monks were physically removed from the conobium, but they were full members of the spiritual community. They could be consulted for prayer, for advice. They often left their solitude to join with the other members of the monastery for communal worship on Sundays and feast days. This entire group of people, perhaps several hundred, was supervised by Abba Sarados. He was the abbot. He was responsible for the daily functioning of the monastery and all the host of problems that community life could entail. And I don't know if this is like the academic dean's job or the provost's job, but he was in charge of everybody. However, he did have resources. The spiritual community was headed by the two anchorites, Barsanuphius and John. Barsanuphius was called the great old man of Gaza. John was called the other old man. These are the two that I mentioned at the beginning, who did not worship with the monks on Sundays, did not visit the city of Gaza. They remained year after year, decade after decade, enclosed in their isolated cells. They would see no one face to face. Well, there's actually an exception. Barsanuphius met directly with Abbot Sarados, who was his own disciple, so they had personal communication face to face, and John had individually met with a disciple of his own. So they each had a disciple that brought them food and brought their letters back and forth. So, does this choice of physical isolation mean that these anchorites are removed from the activities and concerns of the monastery and the surrounding communities? By no means. In fact, I would argue that their physical isolation gave them the opportunity to interact with others, which they would not have had they been absorbed in the daily rhythm and bustle of life in community. Anyone who has had long lines outside their office hours knows what that feels like, right? You have issues that you need to address with substance, but you're being torn away. They don't have that experience. They serve as spiritual directors for the monks, but also not only for the monks, but for the neighboring laity, for civic leaders in Gaza, and for the clergy throughout Palestine. They exercise their spiritual authority through writing and receiving letters. Through this process of correspondence, responding personally to the concerns and questions of individual petitioners, the actual process of spiritual direction that's practiced throughout late antiquity in the early church is actually preserved for us in written form. These letters recreate very intimate conversations between spiritual directors and disciples that would normally be lost to historians altogether. So, how many letters are preserved? Not as many as the emails in my inbox, but they tend to be a bit more substantive. Over 800 letters from the anchorites are extant. But for me, even more remarkable than the monastic wisdom in these anchorites' letters are the summaries of the questions that individual disciples put to the monks. The petitioners range from the Patriarch of Jerusalem to high civic officials in Gaza to the newest monk to join the monastery. But there's one constituency that invites notice. Barsanuphius and John corresponded with lay people. About a quarter of the entire corpus of letters is addressed to Christian laity. In these letters, we hear the questions and concerns of lay Christians as well as the guidance that's offered to them. And it's highly unusual to be able to access the ideas and thoughts of ordinary people in the 6th century, okay? This is not an era for which we have diaries or personal letters or family histories to give us access to ordinary folk. Usually, written texts that survive from the 6th century deal only with the political or the spiritual elite. So the fact that we have hundreds of letters that contain the questions of ordinary people is remarkable. These letters serve as a window into the Christian community in Gaza, comprised of the city, the surrounding villages, the monastery. In the last century, that Palestine is part of the Byzantine Empire. So, what do we learn from all this? Well, I've picked 5 themes that I'd like to mention today to give us some access into the content of this work. The first, there's no separation of sacred and profane. The corollary to that is that there's a very permeable boundary between the lay and monastic community. 6th century Christians recognized that even mundane details of life have spiritual ramifications. The questions of the lay people reflect this assumption. I'm just going to share with you some of my favorites. If locusts are devouring my crops and I chase them away and they move to my neighbor's field, he will be angry with me. What should I do? Can I press my Jewish neighbor's grapes in my wine press? Can I attend a birthday feast in honor of a dear friend who is a pagan? If poor relatives visit me from far away, must I introduce them to rich relations who live nearby? Do I do wrong by giving poor quality wine to the needy and offering my best to visiting monks? My biological father always wants to talk about unworthy topics. How can I avoid these conversations and still show him respect? How do I comfort my friend whose child has died? The correspondence of Barsanuphius and John reveals the varied and complicated relationships that weave society together. We meet Christians, lay Christians, who struggle with competing obligations to friends, family, church, state. They are torn about how to best invest their limited time and energies, and they wonder what the most ethical course is in the midst of situations that seem to make compromise inevitable. Does any of this sound familiar? In many monastic communities, the division between lay Christians and monks seemed large, insurmountable. But in this community, Barsanuphius and John's great concern for the spiritual development of both lay and monastic disciples is refreshing to me. There's definitely a sense of shared Christian vocation. This is demonstrated most dramatically by the fact that when the abbot Sarados dies, he names a layman to succeed him as abbot. Okay. The second theme I want to talk about today that emerges from this community that I think has relevance for us is the issue of navigating doctrinal controversy. Barsanuphius and John lived in an age that was torn by theological controversy. In the previous century, the Council of Chalcedon had attempted to settle conflicting Christological views. The Council of Chalcedon had stated that Christ had 2 natures, one human, one divine. These natures are united in one person. This Christological pronouncement today should sound familiar to you. It's accepted by all branches of Western Christianity. However, it caused serious, and still causes, serious division in the Eastern Church. Many Eastern Christians rejected the formula from Chalcedon because they feared that it separated Christ's humanity too much from his divinity, succumbing to the Nestorian heresy. The lack of ecclesiastical concord threatened to undermine the political unity of the Byzantine Empire, and emperors from the 5th to the 7th centuries worked fervently with little lasting success to reach a Christological position which would unify the Christians in their empire. Throughout Palestine, ordinary lay people and monks, as well as bishops, voiced strong opinions about Christological issues related to this council. Now, while acknowledging the danger of heresy, Barsanuphius instructed his disciples to focus instead on their own sins rather than become obsessed with this debate. They were to abstain from such disputes because they could serve as a distraction to the disciples' own spiritual discipline. Now, in the context of Christological perspectives in this period in Palestine, Barsanuphius is firmly in the middle of the Christological continuum. He's equally opposed to pro- and anti-Chalcedonian camps that are radical. He uses the rhetoric of the non-Chalcedonian party while urging, at the same time, people to follow the leadership of a Chalcedonian patriarch in Jerusalem. Now, this is very unusual. Other well-known monastic leaders are notorious for strident partisan commitments and very inflammatory rhetoric in this conflict. Barsanuphius, however, is hoping to bring reconciliation to the church. Although he values theological orthodoxy, he continually discourages his disciples from debating theology or from condemning those who are suspected of heresy. Motivated by this deep belief that such debate disrupted the process of spiritual direction, he refused to become obsessed with argument or allow his disciples to become preoccupied with a controversy that preoccupied everybody in his day. And I don't want to imply here that theology is not critical, but to highlight this temptation that fighting for correct theology can sometimes become a spiritual temptation to distract people from things they need to be thinking of more urgently. And that's the case here. The third thing I want to share with you from this Christian community is the function of Christians in the prophetic voice speaking to government and church authorities. I mentioned that Barsanuphius himself was probably a little bit hesitant about Chalcedon, but he throws his weight behind the Chalcedonian Patriarch of Jerusalem. When a controversial episcopal election takes place in Gaza, the laity demanded to know of Barsanuphius whom they should support. And the anchorite insisted that the people of Gaza, who, mind you, had a legal voice in the election of their new bishop, that they ought to defer to the judgment of the patriarch in Jerusalem. This does not mean that the old men of Gaza always supported the ecclesiastical hierarchy. In fact, there's a corrupt bishop of Gaza who's deposed and who appealed to the emperor to be reinstated. And Barsanuphius assured the people of Gaza that God would not allow him to return to power. And as the corrupt bishop is presenting an imperial mandate for his reinstatement to the governor for enforcement, word reaches the city that the emperor has died, making the judgment in favor of the bishop void. Finding his access to imperial support cut off, the bishop is furious that he's spent all of his money in vain. The deposed bishop has found the normal routes to power rendered useless. So Barsanuphius' message here is clear. Neither the emperor of Byzantium nor gold can change the future ordained by God and foreseen by the monks. From Barsanuphius and John's letters of spiritual instruction to bishops, it's clear that the holy men saw themselves as having spiritual authority over church leaders. The monks freely offer advice to the bishops, both solicited advice and unsolicited advice. They expect bishops and even patriarchs to heed their instruction, but they don't use this power to publicly challenge the church hierarchy, as other monastic leaders did from time to time. Rather, they use this authority to influence the kind of men who are ordained to the clergy and the way the bishops carry out the work of the church. So they want to be part of the influence on how things are done. Likewise, the anchorites wield power over civic leaders. The holy men work with the Bishop of Gaza to restrain the actions of civil officials, effectively serving as a check on secular power. There's an uprising of the Samaritans that takes place in the 6th century, and the military disturbances that result invite Barsanuphius and John's intervention. Imperial soldiers have been dispatched to the region to suppress the revolt, and these soldiers sent by the emperor began to harass local inhabitants, local peasants. One spokesperson in Gaza describes these soldiers as having coarse minds, tongues which outrun their intelligence, and their right hands outstretched further than their tongues. The people of Gaza blame the unruly soldiers, the merchants who are hoarding supplies, and the military commander of the province for allowing the farmers to suffer. Barsanuphius and John have no reluctance in ordering the powerful people of Gaza to fight on behalf of the poor. They rebuke the bishop for being silent on this matter. They urge him to stand up both to the military governor and the emperor. And eventually, because the bishop is reluctant to do this, they dictate a letter. He asks them to dictate the letter. He doesn't know what to say. And so the monks dictate the letter for the bishop to send to the provincial commander. The provincial commander is a new Christian, and so he's urged to start bearing spiritual fruit. The anchorites also reprimand the Christian governor of the province for ignoring the church's prohibition on attending pagan theater performances and religious festivals. So they're not afraid to speak out. The fourth theme I wanted to draw out from this Christian community is that spiritual authority is exercised in a collaborative fashion. So the collaborative exercise of spiritual authority. Now, spiritual authority as embodied in a particular church is not an idea that seems to have much substance in our Christian communities today. I think our Christianity has lived in close familiarity with the individualistic American consumer approach to life. When we move somewhere new, we shop for a new church home. We carefully weigh the options and find the one that fits us best. And if, as members of a Christian family, a church, things go wrong, as they often do, we're quick just to cut our ties, to leave a local congregation or perhaps the entire denomination. In the best case, we reestablish ourselves in another church community. In the worst case, we forsake communal worship altogether. So in late antiquity, spiritual authority is taken a bit more seriously, I think. But even though it's taken more seriously, that doesn't mean there are fewer challenges. In the community at Tawatha, spiritual authority is a cooperative endeavor. 3 men exercise leadership: Barsanuphius, John, and the abbot Sarados. Beneath these leaders, there are other fathers, experienced monks who lived as hermits in desert cells. But everybody in the monastery looks to Barsanuphius as the ultimate human authority in spiritual matters. However, Barsanuphius works in close cooperation with his colleague. So he's always referring people and deferring to his colleague John. He's always upholding the spiritual authority of his disciple, the abbot of the monastery. The correspondence of Barsanuphius and John presents an ideal of very stable leadership in which the charisma of the anchorite supports the abbot's rule and each father reinforces the others. So although this is the image portrayed, there are many, many signs in the manuscript to hint that things are not as static and unassailable as this idealized image would like you to think. Barsanuphius is building his team of leaders slowly, and very often members of the community directly challenge his system of authority. Sometimes they try to catch the 2 anchorites having different opinions. They want to ask the same question of both and see who gives the easiest answer. Does this sound familiar? My eldest daughter has just learned this technique in dealing with her parents. But Barsanuphius said it's a great response, better than any I've come up with. When a monk has questioned John first on the topic and then gone to Barsanuphius with the same question, Barsanuphius replies, "The God of Barsanuphius and the God of John are one." The coordination of spiritual authority between Barsanuphius and the abbot was challenged even more often, because the partnership of Barsanuphius and John is an equal partnership, yet the abbot is the disciple to Barsanuphius. The abbot presides over the daily activity of the monastery, but Barsanuphius' higher spiritual authority offers disgruntled monks the possibility of appeal. Many petitioners wish to exploit this potential difference. This is hard. Sometimes they want to keep the questions from the abbot, and this is hard to do because the abbot is actually the letter carrier and the scribe. Barsanuphius dictates his letter to the abbot. And so you get this one monk who so much wants to hide his questions from the abbot that he develops this elaborate series of riddles where each letter of the alphabet stands for a different question, trying to bypass the abbot. Okay? Barsanuphius maintained his commitment to communicate only through the abbot, even when circumstances might have made an exception. Here's an example. An old monk comes from Egypt. Barsanuphius was originally from Egypt. So a monk comes from Egypt wanting to ask a word of his spiritual father, Barsanuphius. This is very common practice in the Egyptian desert to say, "Abba, Father, give me a word." But he addresses him in Coptic. And Barsanuphius writes back, Coptic's the language of Egypt, and says, "Brother, we're only going to converse in Greek because my disciple, the abbot, only knows Greek. We're not going to speak in Coptic." So he's bypassing a chance to speak in a native tongue with this newcomer in order to make sure that the abbot stays in the loop. I wanted to bring another example of someone who is trying to challenge the authority of the abbot and get directly to the anchorite. This is a man who's a member of the monastery who's been ordained deacon, and he writes to Barsanuphius. He actually doubts that the letter he gets comes from Barsanuphius, and he says, "Tell me if the first response was from you, because the thought came to me, was it not from the abbot under your name?" So his question actually accuses the abbot of forgery. Barsanuphius rebukes the man for his unwillingness to accept spiritual direction from the abbot, and says, "You've missed spiritual wisdom that would have helped relieve your problem." But he doesn't. That's not the end of the story. After comparing this deacon to the Pharisees who demand a sign from Jesus, Barsanuphius acquiesces and he gives the unbelieving deacon a sign. In an extraordinary development, Barsanuphius arranges for the abbot to stand by the door of his cell and to repeat in a loud voice the words that Barsanuphius has just dictated to him. And that way, the doubting deacon and Barsanuphius are going to hear the actual words that are recorded. This change in the established pattern of communication may give the initial impression that Barsanuphius was yielding to the deacon's attack. Still denying him face-to-face contact, Barsanuphius introduces an oral element to the dialogue, which brings about a greater level of intimacy. But in making this concession, Barsanuphius, I think, is acting on a bold plan designed to neutralize immediately the deacon's objections and to demonstrate with dramatic imagery the humility of both Barsanuphius and the abbot Cerdos. Barsanuphius intends the arrangement to show the length to which he's willing to go to accommodate the weakness of his petitioners. And by participating in this plan, the abbot is also demonstrating his humility and his willingness to work for this man's salvation. Neither abbot or anchorite is expressing anger at these doubts and charges. They attribute the distrust of the deacon to demons who are assaulting him. The task of the holy man and the abbot here is to heal the disbelief, not to castigate the unbeliever. It's interesting, after this long, elaborate story, and it goes on letter after letter after letter, there's no happy ending revealed here. And often in monastic literature, everything works out perfectly at the end to give the specific didactic lesson that's being given. In this series, there's no single happy ending. The deacon continues to be disgruntled page after page after page, year after year after year. And you get the strong realization that the message again here is this temptation is a lifelong struggle. that there are no easy solutions always. So, challenges to the authority, but the critical idea is that spiritual authority has to be collaborative. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is the transfer of spiritual leadership from one generation to the next. This is an appropriate theme to talk about today because I've spent much of this day in the AJ Scholar Selection Meeting trying to define and identify leadership potential. I have heard vocal arguments about who would make the best kind of leader. And let me tell you that Barsanuphius and John would not pick the most obvious candidates, not those with the highest SATs or the strongest letters of recommendation. They liked to look for people who were a little bit rougher. They were willing to take risks, and they invest heavily in the process of mentoring people they've chosen to be leaders. Now, Barsanuphius, John, and Ceridos governed this monastery in Tawatha for several decades. So for a whole generation of monks living here, they've had these same three men ruling over them. They present this idea that spiritual authority is stable and united, but passing that on to the next generation is where it gets tricky. And I just want to share one of the leaders that they choose to mentor. When change comes to this community, it comes quickly and drastically. It's also in the middle of the plague. The same plague, which is the Black Death in the 14th century in Europe, sweeps through Byzantium in the 6th century. So you've got this aftermath of plague where whole communities have been devastated. So in this kind of very tense, unsettled context, Abbot Ceridos falls ill and dies. Okay? Now, when his will is read, he lists several people who might follow him as abbot. And the last name on his list is that of Aelianus, who is still a layperson. And what happens is the other senior monks decline, and Aelianus, the layman, is the one who becomes abbot next. Aelianus is a wealthy layman. He's not a member of the monastic community. However, he has already been a disciple of Barsanuphius and John, which again shows you that permeable monastic lay boundary. He's a close disciple of Barsanuphius and John, has been contemplating becoming a monk, but he's got a deal. He's got family obligations and property and a mother and slaves and all these people to deal with before he can become a monk. So this is what he's worrying about, not knowing that he's been named the next abbot. Ceridos, the abbot, had gained sufficient insight into Aelianus' character to believe that he would not only be a good monk, but a good abbot. And I think that it's really perhaps his position in the world, dealing with property and family, that makes him attractive to Ceridos. Because the duties of abbot not only include spiritual direction, but management of resources in the monastery, interaction with the monastery and the outside world. Now, when Aelianus becomes abbot, this is not the only change. It's not only a new person and a lay person who's never been a monk becoming abbot. The change is bigger than this, because John announces that he's going to die within 2 weeks of Ceridos' death. And this is always a sign of sanctity in late antiquity. If you know when you're going to die, that proves that you're really holy. And Barsanuphius announces that he's not choosing another disciple. Remember, Ceridos is the one who comes back and forth and brings the letters. He's actually just going to withdraw to his cell and have no further communication with this monastery. So they go from this three-person collaborative network of spiritual authority to one person in charge who has never lived in the monastery, who's a layperson. It's a huge shift in the transfer of authority. And Aelianus is desperate. He's got all the monks behind him crying as he begs first Barsanuphius and then John to give him help. And with this appeal, John finally consents, and it says he'll delay his death by a couple of weeks. So I think at first he announced he's going to die, and then he says, no, I'll give you 2 weeks of instruction. So we have these long series of letters where Aelianus is frantically communicating with John through letters, trying to get all the details right about what he's supposed to do when he's on his own. The topics they discuss, many of them deal with the relationship of the monastery to the outside world, with the relationship of Aelianos as abbot with the previous abbot Ceridos, if I want to change something that we've always done, can I do that? And also how to offer spiritual direction to the monks. Remember, he's never lived in the monastery, so actually how to be a father to this community. So we have 2 weeks of frantic questions, and then it's over. Barsanuphius withdraws, John dies. We have little evidence to evaluate how well Aelianos did as abbot. There are few works that survive after this time. You might think that's the end of the community, right? It didn't make it. However, there are different hints. It's possible that Aelianos chose to reconstruct that collaborative system of spiritual authority. Maybe he went to some of those fathers, those anchorites that were connected to the community, and formed a relationship with them like Ceridos had with Barsanuphius and John. That's a possibility. But we're left at the end of one chapter, the opening of another chapter, not really knowing what comes next. The one thing we do know, though, is that these letters to the anchorites survive, that people in the monastery valued this group of letters enough to preserve them and copying them, and they're preserved in manuscripts. So something continues. Whether or not this particular community makes it through the next generation, we don't know. But the spiritual wisdom of the community does. The issues that Barsanuphius and John and their disciples struggle with, the relationship of the spiritual priorities to daily life, the proper response to theological controversy, and the best way to maintain, build, and pass on spiritual authority, I think are still critical questions for Christians living in community today. We won't answer them in the same way that people did in the 6th century, but I think it is useful to consider their example. I think we can learn not only from the answers they chose, not only from their successes and failures, but actually from the way they framed their questions. So thank you.